Something happened on January 10, 2026, that most Americans haven't heard about yet. Iran's judiciary chief, Gholam Hossein Mohseni-Ejei, stood before state television cameras and promised punishment for protesters that would be decisive, maximum, and without any legal leniency. Within hours, the Attorney General went further, declaring demonstrators enemies of God, a charge that carries the death penalty under Iranian law. I've spent 2 decades watching geopolitical crises ripple through energy markets. What keeps me up at night isn't the rhetoric. It's what happened next. Oil traders didn't wait for bodies to pile up. They didn't wait for diplomacy to fail. They started repricing risk immediately. Brent crude climbed more than 10% in 5 trading sessions. WTI hit $61.15 per barrel on January 13th, the highest level since October. Here's what nobody's connecting. This isn't just about oil prices at the pump. It's about a cascading sequence of financial recalibrations happening right now, quietly, in insurance, underwriting rooms, and freight rate negotiations. You're going to feel this. And here's why you should care. Let me show you what the data actually reveals. The protests began on December 28, 2025, triggered by Iran's rial currency collapsing to 1.4 million per dollar. Within days, demonstrations spread across all 31 Iranian provinces. By the first week of January, more than 2,000 people had been arrested. At least 27 civilians killed, including 6 children, according to the Center for Human Rights in Iran. Now here's where it gets interesting. Iran's judiciary didn't just threaten punishment. They invoked specific legal mechanisms designed to eliminate dissent permanently. Mohseni-Ejei referenced mofsed-e-filars, or corruption on earth, a capital offense. This isn't new language. Iran executed at least 2,167 people in 2025 alone. That's the highest level in contemporary Iranian history. In December 2025, they averaged 12 executions per day. But the markets weren't reacting to human rights violations. They were reacting to vulnerability. Here's what I found digging through congressional research reports. Iran exports approximately 2 million barrels of oil per day. Most of it flows through the Strait of Hormuz, a 21-mile-wide passage between Iran and Oman. 20% of the world's petroleum moves through that choke point every single day, roughly 20 million barrels. When protests reach all 31 provinces, skilled workers can't get to production facilities. Power grids become unstable. Even without deliberate sabotage, operational interruptions become inevitable. Energy analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies confirmed this pattern. Widespread upheaval means workers can't reach export terminals. When they get there, they may not have electricity. Now here's what nobody's connecting. Marine insurance premiums for ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz jumped 60% as of June 2025, when Israel and Iran exchanged airstrikes. That was before these protests. Before Trump's locked and loaded warning on January 9th. Aviation insurers have now gone on alert. Underwriters are scrambling to reassess airspace exposure across the entire Middle Eastern region. Let me be clear about what this means in practice. Shipping firms are rerouting vessels and increasing insurance coverage right now. That leads to higher freight rates. Higher freight rates mean inflation in everything those ships carry. Electronics, clothing, auto parts, food commodities. The inflationary pressure doesn't announce itself with a press conference. It accumulates in supply chains over weeks and months. The oil price spike itself tells a story. On January 12th, Brent crude hit $63.89 per barrel. Then Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi appeared on television, claiming the government had the situation under total control. Prices retreated. But here's what keeps me up at night. Options volume for Brent crude reached record levels. Hedge funds and institutional investors are paying the biggest premiums for insurance against a future rally, since Israel and Iran exchanged strikes in the summer. That's not speculation. That's cold calculation. Traders are pricing in a tail risk scenario, a maritime conflict that disrupts not just Iranian oil, but access to Gulf exports from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, UAE, Iraq, and Qatar. Combined, those countries export over 15 million barrels per day through the strait. What comes next when an economy doesn't have decades to fix itself? Iran's inflation rate already exceeded 40% before these protests began. The government's proposed budget for 2025 to 2026 prioritizes deficit spending and massive tax increases to compensate for declining oil revenues. Merchants across the country are being blamed as price gougers for refusing state-standardized pricing. You cannot restock inventory if compliance bankrupts you. On January 2nd, Iran International cited intelligence analysts suggesting Iran might have entered early stages of regime collapse. By January 4th, Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi himself described the government as being in survival mode, unable to reverse economic problems or handle military threats from the United States or Israel. That admission didn't come from opposition activists. It came from the regime's own foreign minister. Let me walk you through what survival mode looks like in energy markets. Chevron saw initial gains during the volatility period. ExxonMobil jumped 2.5% as prices peaked, then surrendered those gains when markets stabilized. But airlines and logistics firms took immediate hits. United Airlines and Delta faced pressure as jet fuel costs tracked the crude spike. FedEx and UPS navigated complex challenges balancing temporary price volatility against capital expenditure plans. These aren't abstract market movements. Every airline ticket you buy factors in fuel cost projections. Every package shipped overnight includes freight rate assumptions. When energy prices spike, those assumptions fail. Companies either absorb losses or pass costs to consumers. There's no third option. Now here's where regime survival and market mechanics collide. Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf gave a speech warning that U.S. military bases and regional ships would be subject to retaliation if Iran is attacked. Hardline politicians shouted, "Death to America," on the parliament floor. Trump responded that he was weighing military options and that Iran would pay a big price. This is a game of signaling, but signals have consequences. On January 10th, the IRGC warned that safeguarding security is a red line. When a military force declares a red line during civil unrest, they're not addressing protesters. They're addressing their own rank and file. They're shoring up loyalty. Senior U.S. intelligence officers told Axios their evaluation that these protests weren't capable of destabilizing the regime was being reassessed. Every day without resolution narrows Iran's options. The longer protests persist, the more brutal the crackdown must become to restore control. The more brutal the crackdown, the greater the international pressure. The greater the pressure, the higher the risk of miscalculation. One warning shot across the bow of a commercial tanker. One Iranian fast attack boat approaching too close to a U.S. Navy destroyer. One cyber operation that goes too far. Markets don't wait for those moments to happen. They price in the probability now. That's why Brent gained more than 4% in just 2 trading sessions when Iran concerns intensified. That's why traders paid record premiums for options protecting against supply disruptions. They've seen this movie before. They know how quickly things can escalate when a regime feels cornered. Let me show you a pattern you need to recognize. In June 2025, Israeli forces launched strikes against Iranian military and nuclear infrastructure. Iran retaliated with missile attacks. The Strait of Hormuz was never actually closed, but Brent crude jumped 7% in one day. from $69 to $74 per barrel. Price moved on threat perception alone, not on actual supply disruption, not on physical blockades, on the possibility that the strait might be threatened. That 7% jump translated into billions of dollars in wealth transferred from consumers to energy producers. Airlines adjusted ticket prices. Trucking companies recalculated shipping rates. Refineries hedged future costs. All based on a conflict that never touched the strait itself. Now we're facing a different scenario. Internal collapse carries risks. External conflict doesn't. When a government fights a foreign enemy, the population often rallies behind the regime. When a government fights its own people, loyalty fractures. Supply chains don't just face physical damage. They face the breakdown of coordination itself. Here's what I mean. Iran's oil production depends on skilled workers showing up at remote facilities, engineers maintaining complex equipment, technicians monitoring export terminals, government officials signing off on shipments. When protests spread across 31 provinces, when security forces shoot protesters in the streets, when the regime declares demonstrators enemies of God, that coordination network starts failing. Clay Sagal at the Center for Strategic and International Studies laid it out clearly. In situations of widespread upheaval, skilled workers may be unable to reach production facilities. When they arrive, they may not have basic utilities like electric power. Those two factors together create strong probability of production interruptions. Even without deliberate sabotage, even without strikes on infrastructure. The markets understand this. On January 9th, analysts at Energy Aspects wrote that excitement about rapid rebounds in oil output from Venezuela or Iran risks putting the cart before the horse. They weren't talking about hope. They were talking about structural dysfunction. You can't flip a switch and restore complex industrial operations in the middle of civil unrest. China is Iran's biggest customer. Chinese refiners purchased more than 80% of Iranian-shipped crude in 2025. Most of that buying comes from smaller independent refiners called teapots, willing to buy sanctioned barrels at a risk discount. If Iranian exports collapse, those Chinese buyers shift to Russian oil. Russian sellers raise prices. The entire supply chain reprices. But here's what makes this different from previous crises. The global oil market is currently in a superglut phase. Production exceeds demand. U.S. crude stockpiles rose 5.23 million barrels in the week, ending January 9th. Gasoline inventories climbed 8.23 million barrels. Distillate inventories rose 4.34 million barrels. In a normal supply environment, that inventory build would crash prices. Instead, prices rose. That tells you everything about how seriously traders are taking this risk. They're willing to pay a premium now to protect against tail risk scenarios later, even when physical fundamentals suggest prices should fall. Let me walk you through the historical parallel that matters. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, both countries attacked commercial shipping. 411 ships were attacked over 8 years. 239 were petroleum tankers. Iran repeatedly threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz. They never followed through. But insurance rates climbed. Shipping routes adjusted. Military escorts became necessary. The difference now? Iran faces internal collapse, not external war. The regime doesn't have the luxury of measured retaliation against foreign enemies. They're fighting their own population. When Iran's parliament voted in support of closing the strait on June 23, 2025, during the Israeli conflict, it required approval from the Supreme National Security Council and Supreme Leader. That process creates checks, deliberation, strategic calculation. Internal collapse eliminates those checks. When a military force feels existential threat from within, decision-making becomes reactive, desperate. Miscalculation probability rises exponentially. One bad day in the Strait of Hormuz. One Iranian patrol boat commander who overreacts to a U.S. Navy vessel. One American destroyer captain who misreads Iranian intentions. And you have a shooting incident that neither side wants, but both must respond to. Trump has repeatedly warned that if Tehran violently kills peaceful protesters, America will come to their rescue. On January 9th, he stated the U.S. was locked and loaded and ready to go if Iranian security forces killed protesters. Retired General Jack Keane told Fox News that if he were in the Iranian regime, he would take Trump dead serious. Markets believe him. That's why shipping firms are rerouting vessels now. That's why aviation insurers are reassessing airspace exposure now. That's why freight rates are rising now. Before any military action, before any strait closure, before any supply disruption, the death toll keeps climbing. Initial reports indicated at least 42 people killed, then 70. By January 9th, hospitals in Tehran and Shiraz were overwhelmed with injured protesters, many with gunshot wounds. Security forces have been documented shooting indiscriminately with live ammunition. On January 13th, Iran International reported at least 12,000 people had been killed. They described it as the largest killing in Iranian contemporary history. I cannot independently verify that 12,000 figure. No one outside Iran can. The regime shut down internet access. International phone lines went dark. What we do know is this. When a government cuts off information flows that completely, when they use artillery-level force against civilian protesters, when their own foreign minister admits they're in survival mode, you're witnessing a regime that has already lost control. They're just refusing to acknowledge it. Here's what that means for markets. Regime change in Iran would be seismic. Not because Americans care about Iranian politics, because of what it would do to global energy dynamics. Iran has been under strict U.S. sanctions since 2018. Those sanctions force Iranian oil to sell at discounts. Chinese buyers get cheap barrels. Russian and Saudi producers face less competition. European, Indian, and Japanese refiners pay premium prices for non-sanctioned oil. Regime change potentially eliminates those sanctions. Iranian oil floods back into legitimate markets. European refiners get access to cheap crude. Indian buyers diversify away from expensive alternatives. Japanese importers reduce dependence on distant suppliers. Chinese teapots and Middle Eastern producers face stiffer competition. The entire pricing structure of global oil markets reshapes. Analysts at market tracker Kepler said on January 11th that, while full regime collapse remains a low probability event, rising risk is already lifting the geopolitical premium in oil markets. Any disruption through factional conflict, export curbs, or external intervention could prompt near-term price spikes despite global surpluses. Over the medium term, regime change could unlock sanctions relief and reshape trade flows. That's the tug-of-war traders are navigating right now. Massive supply surplus pushing prices down. Geopolitical tail risk pulling prices up. Neither force wins cleanly. So prices whipsaw. Volatility spikes. Insurance premiums surge. Companies that depend on stable input costs find their planning models worthless. United Airlines and FedEx aren't concerned about Iranian human rights. They're concerned about fuel cost unpredictability destroying profit margins. When you book a flight 6 months from now, the airline hedges fuel costs based on forward curve expectations. If those expectations prove wrong by 20%, because of supply shocks, someone eats the loss. Either the airline cuts service, or passengers pay higher fares, or shareholders accept reduced returns. This is how distant geopolitical events reach your wallet. Not through dramatic announcements. Through quiet recalibrations in risk models. Through insurance premiums adjusted by actuaries you'll never meet. through freight rates negotiated by logistics companies you've never heard of. The accumulated weight of those adjustments shows up months later as higher prices on everyday goods. Ben Cahill, Director for Energy Markets at the University of Texas Austin Center for Energy and Environmental Systems Analysis, described Iran as sitting at the nerve center of the global oil market. That's not hyperbole. The Strait of Hormuz is the most critical energy choke point on Earth. 22% of global liquefied natural gas trade passes through it. 27% of the world's crude oil and petroleum products maritime trade flows through it daily. There is no replacement infrastructure. Saudi Arabia has a pipeline system from Abqaiq to Yanbu on the Red Sea, with design capacity of 5 million barrels per day. Current utilization is estimated at 1.7 million barrels per day, leaving about 3.3 million barrels per day of spare capacity. That's helpful. It's not sufficient. UAE and Iraq have limited pipeline alternatives. Iran itself has the Ghore-Jask pipeline and Jask export terminal on the Gulf of Oman, designed to bypass the strait entirely. It has seen minimal utilization. If the strait closes, even temporarily, there is no way to quickly replace 15 to 20 million barrels per day of transit capacity. Prices would spike. Not by 7%, by multiples of that. Refineries would run short on feedstock. Gasoline prices would surge. Diesel prices would follow. Jet fuel costs would skyrocket. Airlines would ground flights. Trucking companies would park vehicles. Manufacturing plants dependent on petroleum-based inputs would slow or stop production. That cascading failure would trigger economic contraction globally. Not a recession measured in quarters. A supply shock measured in weeks. The last time Americans experienced energy-driven economic crisis at that scale was the 1970s. Gasoline lines. Rationing. Anger that toppled governments. Modern markets are supposed to prevent that scenario. Strategic petroleum reserves. Diverse supply. Sources. Sophisticated hedging instruments. But all those mechanisms assume markets have time to adjust. They assume disruptions happen gradually. They assume signals get read correctly, and responses happen rationally. Internal collapse in Iran offers none of those assumptions. It offers chaos, miscalculation, desperate actors making existential decisions under extreme pressure. That's why options volume hit record levels. That's why aviation insurers went on alert. That's why shipping firms increased insurance coverage before any shots were fired. Let me bring this full circle. On January 5th, Iran's judiciary chief called for decisive response against protesters without leniency. He accused them of being linked to Israel and the United States. That wasn't judicial rhetoric. That was activating legal frameworks for mass execution. Iran's newly passed law escalates penalties for alleged cooperation with Israel and the US to capital punishment. We've seen this pattern before. After the 2019 protests, Iran executed dozens. After the 2022 protests, they executed more. The Center for Human Rights in Iran warned that such statements significantly increase the risk of enforced disappearances, mass arbitrary detentions, and harsh sentences, including death penalty, as seen during previous protest crackdowns. The markets aren't pricing in human rights concerns. They're pricing in what happens when a government loses legitimacy but retains military force, when authority fractures but violence escalates, when a country that sits on critical energy infrastructure enters a death spiral that plays out over months, not days. Here's what I've learned watching crises for 2 decades. The moment you're certain about outcomes is the moment you've stopped paying attention. I don't know if Iran's regime will collapse. I don't know if Trump will order military strikes. I don't know if the Strait of Hormuz will close. What I know is this: markets are repricing risk right now based on probabilities, not certainties. Insurance companies are recalculating exposure. Shipping firms are adjusting routes. Airlines are hedging fuel costs. Logistics companies are building in risk premiums. All of that happens quietly, behind closed doors, in spreadsheets and actuarial models. You'll feel the results in 3 to 6 months. Higher prices at the pump, more expensive groceries, increased shipping costs passed through to consumers, inflation that doesn't come with dramatic headlines, just persistent grinding pressure on household budgets. The pattern repeats throughout history. Financial crises, energy shocks, geopolitical instability. The warning signs appear long before the consequences arrive. The smart money moves first. The institutions adjust second. Regular people feel it last. That's not conspiracy. That's information asymmetry. Traders have access to data streams most people never see. They react to signals most people don't recognize. By the time consequences become obvious, the repricing is already done. So here's my question for you. When you see crude oil prices climbing, when you hear about tensions in the Middle East, when insurance premiums surge for shipping firms you've never heard of, do you recognize those as early warning signals? Or do you wait until gas hits $6 a gallon to start paying attention? Because by then, the game is already over. The wealth has already transferred. The costs have already been locked in. All that remains is the slow realization that something fundamental shifted while you weren't looking. Iran's protests aren't about Iranian politics for American consumers. They're about whether a critical choke point in global energy infrastructure remains stable. Whether a regime facing existential threat makes rational decisions or desperate ones. Whether markets can price in catastrophic tail risk fast enough to prevent economic shock. Right now, the answer is uncertain. Options. Traders are paying record premiums because they don't know either. They're just willing to pay more than you to protect themselves from finding out the hard way. That's the story. Not in the headlines. In the data. In the quiet recalibrations happening in back offices and trading floors. In the insurance underwriters reassessing exposure. In the shipping executives rerouting vessels. In the airline CFOs hedging fuel costs 6 months forward. The question isn't whether you should care, it's whether you're willing to see what's already happening before it shows up in your bank account. Drop your analysis in the comments. What am I missing? What are the market signals you're watching? Because this story is still unfolding, and the ending hasn't been written yet.